I can't conceive, the nucleus of all, begins inside a tiny seed, and what we think as insignificant provides the purest air we breathe. But who am I to doubt or question the inevitable being? For these are but a few discoveries we find inside the secret life of plants. A species smaller than the eye can see, or larger than most living things. And yet we take from it, without consent, our shelter, food, habiliment. But who am I to doubt or question the inevitable being? For these are but a few discoveries we find inside the secret life of plants. Those were the lyrics from the soundtrack, The Secret Life of Plants, which was sung by Stevie Wonder, hard to believe, in 1979. He actually wrote the soundtrack to this amazing, amazing documentary film that I saw many years ago. Perhaps you've seen it as well, The Secret Life of Plants. That has always been a very interesting subject for me. The idea and what the documentary is about, and you could probably tell by just those few lyrics that I read to you, that the idea that plants are not only alive but intelligent and conscious. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. I want to talk a little bit more about the impetus for developing that documentary, which is, by the way, based on a very controversial book by authors Peter Tompkins and Christopher Bird, based on a whole litany of experiments that were conducted many, many years ago now. And of course, though it wasn't solely based on the work of Cleve Baxter, certainly his incredible work inspired what the basis for this book and then documentary is all about. And I want to get into the Cleve Baxter experiments in a minute. But let me first tell you what inspired me, what sort of prompted me to have this conversation with you today. And by the way, welcome. You know, I typically like to jump in. Let me welcome you all to Conscious Commentary in the Garden on somewhat of a cloudy, partially sunny, and a little drizzly day. I'm hoping I can get the whole show in before, once again, we've got a bit of a sun shower. Interesting, nonetheless. Let's talk about what prompted me to have this conversation with you today. Did you all have a chance to see my absolutely amazing conversation with Billy Carson last week? It was last Wednesday. We went live, and it was such a delight and so much fun to have Billy on the show. Well, if you saw that conversation, in fact, maybe you were a part of the chat, you may have had a chance to watch this little clip that I'm going to play for you right now, and that will explain what prompted me to have this conversation with you today. So let's take a look at this, and I'll be right back.
There's certain people that are just better at certain things. Certain people's frequencies are set to in certain ways in the universe that things manifest for them in certain ways that maybe not for others. So if that's the case, you have to do everything you possibly can to work on your manifestation. Now, one thing that you might be doing wrong is you might be eating meat. And so one of the people were like, what are you talking about? I said, well, I'm not saying to go vegan. I said, but when you're in the manifestation process, you have to remember that when you're eating meat, a lot of this meat that we're eating has been tortured. It's suffered for its entire lifespan. It's been it's been injected with all kind of things, and it's had a very sorrowful life. And because DNA stores memories, as I've shown people many times, DNA, scientifically proven, stores information and stores epigenetic memories as well. An animal, living thing, has what? It has DNA. And so that DNA is now stored memories of all the torture, all the suffering, all the pain, all the agony, all the despair, all the depression, not only for itself, but for its generations even behind it that have went through that same exact process. Now you consume this meat into your body and you think, I'm vibrating in a high vibration, I'm operating in unconditional love, I'm helping people, I'm of service to others, I'm meditating, I'm doing all this stuff. But now you just consume some meat that has such a low vibrating frequency and energy coming out of that DNA, and it's in your body, in your bloodstream, entangling with your DNA, and now bringing your frequency down. So in your mind, I'm high frequency. Not actually. All that meat that you're consuming, that tortured flesh, is bringing down your frequency, giving you a less greater chance of succeeding in what you're trying to manifest.
Now, before I get into a comment that I would like to read to you that came out of that particular segment during our conversation with Billy Carson last week, I want to get into the very briefly summary of Cleve Baxter's work. We're talking decades ago now, but he was involved in a set of very, very controversial and yet I think telling experiments having to do with testing the intelligence of plant life. And as I understand it, there are obviously a lot more details to the actual experiment, but what he decided to do is hook up plants to a polygraph machine. And what his intention was to do was to, I believe, light a match and see if the plants would react to being burned by the match. Now, seems like a fairly straightforward experiment within the context of what he was trying to achieve. But here's where the surprise really occurred. What he noticed, because he had the plants already hooked up to the polygraph before he lit the match and subsequently burned the leaf or leaves, just by the act of thinking and anticipating that this was what he was about to do, he noticed that the polygraph had registered fluctuations as if it had already happened. So not only did it seem that he was getting a reaction from the plants, not after or during the time that they were being burned by a match, but just the act of thinking and anticipating and planning to burn the leaf, it reacted, or they reacted to the thought. So clearly he was confounded by the whole process, and I suppose went through with the actual experiment. I'm going to look into it more, and perhaps we can link a little bit of information. This has always been profound to me, guys, because it really, really does say, I mean, we know plants are alive, obviously. We use that term rather loosely, but of course they're alive, and they die like the corporeal physical structure of ourselves does eventually. However, alive is one thing, but being conscious is another. Are these plants intelligent? Now, I tend to think that there is a measure of intelligence in all things, and we can even talk about the idea of something called Panpsychism, which I find very intriguing. But before we go maybe a little bit deeper into that, I want to read a comment, one of the quite a few comments that came out of my conversation with Billy Carson last week, specifically based on the clip that I just played for you. Let me read this to you. This individual says, "I understand what you were trying to get across about not eating meat. But then again, what about plants? It has been shown that plants have reactions to negative and positive words and different types of music and so on. So what about those creatures? What happens when they are ripped out of the ground by these big cruel pieces of machinery to be harvested and eaten? Does their DNA not produce the same effect as an animal would?" Fair question. And as I glanced at that comment, not necessarily surprising, there were not a lot of rebuttals or replies, but there were some. So it did definitely elicit some controversy. I have to tell you that many years ago, and it was probably before I even became aware of the work of Cleve Baxter. I mean, look, I've always had somewhat of a visceral sense that there was and is a measure of intelligence, and perhaps much larger than we realize, in all living things, including the trees that surround me. I'm in my garden. You can see behind me the trees in the background and the beautiful hydrangeas, etc. Well, I'll tell you something, guys. I talk to the trees. I'm not ashamed to say I talk to the trees. As a matter of fact, I was out here yesterday barefoot having a little conversation with one of my favorite trees, but that's beside the point. Not necessarily. But alive, I really think so. And this is something that, despite as much as I admire the work of Cleve Baxter, I don't know that we necessarily need science to show us what we really feel inside. But with that said, and the comment that I just read to you, is that a fair question? And it's one that I have pondered for quite some time. Let's talk about panpsychism very briefly. I want to touch on that. I've talked about that before, and I believe one of the first times I brought it up was in a conversation, an on-location show that I filmed with Nassim Haramein, who has written about this idea. It's a fairly new term, panpsychism, which basically says, in a nutshell, that there is a measure of individuated consciousness that exists in all things, whether animate or inanimate. Now, this is a postulate that I believe, and frankly, the name itself developed by more of a mainstream scientific framework. So I find it, even though that in and of itself is very controversial, and there are a lot of caveats to how they came up with what would define panpsychism, or in what to what degree it exists. It's still quite interesting to me that this sort of discussion is now happening in more of a mainstream academia. So panpsychism essentially says, and perhaps I'm distilling it, maybe even a little, it's more complicated and I'm making it very simple, but just for the sake of argument, that, the tissue that I'm holding up right here has some form of consciousness. Well, I mean, that would make sense if plants have, if the natural world has a measure of consciousness, and invariably all things paper comes from wood, and other materials that create the things that, the tripod that I'm looking at right here, metals, everything comes from the natural world. And then obviously there's graduation or maybe devolution into a more animate form. So let's assume that all things have consciousness. And based on what Billy was talking about, and of course this was in the context of the idea of manifestation, and in order to be able to entangle, to quantum entangle as he put it in this segment, we need to have a clear channel, and he feels, in his humble opinion, that in order to do that entangling, have that clear channel, we need to be free of the consumption of meat, at least for the period of time that we're looking to manifest, because of the fact that we may be taking on the DNA of the torture that's going on with the animals prior to us consuming. Okay, fair enough. But could it be that there's a measure of torture that's going on? And I'm making a little face because I know this is very controversial, guys, please. And by the way, I'm not going to try to steer you one way or another. I just think it's an interesting idea to ponder. I really do. I mean, think about Cleve Baxter and this experiment that he was about to do. I mean, look, the idea of taking a match to a plant, you could argue, was unethical. That would hurt. Eek! And apparently, again, even prior to the act taking place, the plants registered their angst on the polygraph. So what does that tell you? If you yank a plant out of your garden, which God knows I do a lot of that these days because I'm a gardener, I've got a vegetable garden, millions of us do, yanking it out, are we torturing the plant, and then are we consuming it? Or not are we, when we consume it, are we in essence taking on just a tiny measure of that torture? I'm going to leave that alone. I put the question out there. I don't have an answer, and yet I think it's a fascinating discussion to have. We don't want this to be impetus for an argument. That's not why I'm doing this episode. It's just something to think about. And it's something that I didn't realize was as popular of a discussion point until I looked it up. I figured I'd Google it, and lo and behold, I did. And guess what? When I Googled, I'm trying to think of the terms that I used, plants conscious vegan, I think it was something like that. I came up with 130 million results. Didn't go through all of them, obviously, but I came up with some interesting headlines I want to share with you. That just goes to show you that this is a conversation that's happening on a wider scale than many of us think. So some of the headlines read the following: how come animal lives matter, but plants don't? Can plants feel pain? Again, we go back to the work of Cleve Baxter and the experiment. Plants have feelings too. The brutal truth every vegan needs to see. And this by the New York Times back in 2009. Their headline, and you have to admit this is a little tongue-in-cheek, says, Brussels sprouts like to live too. I'm going to link this one so you can read it. So the bottom line is this conversation didn't just happen on my channel during or as a result of my conversation with Billy Carson. It has come up. I want to reiterate that this is not a judgment call on anyone. I think it is very, very important to do what your mind, your heart, your soul, and most importantly, what your body tells you to do. I'm so tempted to get a little bit deeper. I have looked into this a little bit, and I know that there are conversations going on and have gone on about some of the perhaps unhealthy aspects of being vegan, and the question of, do we need, some of us, everybody is different. But let me go on to something else. Let's just assume, for argument's sake, that if the hypothesis that Billy put forth is true, within the context of manifestation, heck, within the context of putting in damaging DNA into our system, and does that affect the agility of our own structure, not just bodily structure, but even spiritually? Let me read something to you, another term. Just go do a little bit of research to come to you today and talk about this. I learned so many things. Here's another term that I did not know existed until today, when I was studying this idea of, what if we decided that taking in not only meat, but plants and seeds and veggies are also harmful. Now, I don't know that there are a lot of people that would feel that way, not yet, but there are a group of people that, I don't know if it's that idea that brought them to this, but they don't eat. This is allegedly the case here. You know what they're called? Breatharians. Breatharians, let me spell it for you. B, like breath, Breatharians. Now I'm going to read something to you that I found out about what this is all about. So, Breatharians believe that a person can give up food and water altogether and live purely off of prana, which they also call living on light or living on air. Foremost Breatharian, let's see if I pronounce this right, Jazz Muheen, whose name was formerly Ellen Grieve, is credited with starting today's Breatharian movement. Her prana program advises followers to convert to breatharianism gradually, becoming a vegetarian, become a vegan, move to raw foods, then fruits, then liquids, and finally prana. You replace physical food with air and light, as well as metaphysical nourishment, end quote. That came from science.howstuffworks.com. I think I'll link that as well. Can humans survive on air alone? And that's an interesting question to ask right now, isn't it? When so much of our oxygen supply seems to be depleted based on how we're living and the fact that we've got to, cover up. Another conversation for another time. We know that oxygen is important and it is nourishing to our bodies, of course, but can people actually live on prana, energy, oxygen alone? Well, some say yes. As a matter of fact, it was several years ago, prior to the passing of Dolores Cannon, that I actually took on a talk that she said, and I could swear it was her, where she talked about the idea of individuals who claim to live purely on sunlight as sustenance. So it wasn't so much about oxygen, obviously that comes with being in the environment, but that they felt that their sustenance was coming purely from solar energy, and there's a very, very strict protocol for how to take that on. This is obviously very, very controversial. And if you know anything about this, maybe you're a breatharian yourself, let me know. I'd love to hear more about it. So I guess I bring that up in this context because if you were, let's say you were to wake up one morning and go, oh my God, I actually get that now. Maybe you're a vegan or maybe you're a carnivore. I do eat meat. I'm trying to keep it down, but I still eat meat. But I love vegetables too. I love food. It seems that our bodies still need it, guys. So, I think it's a judgment call individually. But this idea of being able to, you wake up one morning and say, I'm not going to eat ever again. I'm just going to take in the sun. Could you do it? I have a feeling I know what the answer would be for a lot of you. Something just occurred to me when we talk about giving up food. This just came to me. And it has to do with transitioning. We've heard many times, and in fact probably in most cases, when a person is about to cross over, about to die, the body will, as it begins to shut down, does not have the need for food anymore or liquids. And I've talked to people who have had loved ones, even days, sometimes weeks prior to passing, where they just don't feel the need to take on food anymore or water. And it just occurred to me, that's very interesting, as we prepare to go into, of course, sustenance, as we understand it, is primarily for the corporeal form. And if that's about to be shed, why would we need it? But I think there's something a little deeper there. Getting ready for a less dense life, perhaps more spiritually endowed life. The body, well, not the body, but the soul will prepare for that elevation. I always pause when I speak hierarchically, but let's call it a lighter existence, literally light. Food is not needed anymore, even if the body plans on being around a little while longer. It's very interesting. Could it be that if there are individuals who are able to give up all matter of solid food, whether seed, plant, vegetable, fruit, and beyond, meat and other things, grain, that there is some sense or pull toward living more spiritually endowed life? Again, this is not a multiple choice question. This is not a yes or no, an either or. It's just an interesting juxtaposition when you look at that dynamic of people that are preparing to die, even if the body, you could argue, could be around maybe even months. I've heard of that. People just lose their appetite. It's not necessary. These are all just intriguing questions to me. And I know you're seeing this title and going, Plant Lives Matter. Wonder where she got that from. But I wanted to get your attention, to bring you into the conversation, and not to come out of it with an argument or an either or. I'm going to just say, this is a quote I want to read to you by Shakespeare. I think it comes from the play Hamlet, and I've used it so many times. There is nothing good nor bad except thinking makes it so. I suppose all of these questions that we have are relative according to how we feel. It's just an interesting dynamic. I say follow your heart and soul and do what your body tells you to do. I know individuals who had made a decision to become vegetarian and maybe eventually vegan, but their body over a period of time was clearly craving the nutrients that come out of certain types of meat. So the body will fluctuate and tell you what it needs. But again, as for the ethics involved in all of this, here's a point I wanted to make before we close out. Ethics, saying that word triggered this thought. I've read so much over the years, seen so much, and oftentimes won't be able to recall the source where it actually came from. But I do recall several conversations or things that I have read where people were having a conversation similar to this. And what came up was the idea that, how do you justify taking in something that is alive and conscious and not feel a measure of guilt? And I believe this is talked about in certain religious texts as well. The fish, of course, are alive and to a degree conscious. Wouldn't that be considered, by taking that on, is there an ethical question there? And some people say that it's felt that certain life forms give of themselves in order to sustain other life forms. In other words, you'd call it sacrifice, I suppose. So those are some of the ideas that I've pondered over the years, never coming out with a definitive conclusion. Guys, I try my best to put observation and question, but observation without tethering myself to a certain outcome. I've always been that way. I think that by doing so, it just allows more ideas to come in. But I have thought about that. Are there certain forms of life, conscious life, including the plants and including some meat, animals, I should say, that willingly give of themselves their milk from the cow, or the meat from a cow itself, the chicken, the on and on and on. I don't have an answer. I know that that has come up in the past. So again, as we end this particular conversation, I would say to you, as always, keep an open heart, open mind, listen to both, listen to your body, talk to the plants, ask them, let's ask them. A lot of people talk about blessing the food that they're taking in and thanking the food for giving of itself to feed you. So I think there are a lot of ways. I think what we really need to do, we can't go wrong here, is to have a measure of humility and compassion and honor for that which we're taking in, and bless it and take it in and say thank you for giving of yourself to me, no matter where you stand on this. So that's that. So there'll be a couple of links. I think I'm going to link the New York Times article, see if I can find a little summary on Cleve Baxter's work, because again, fascinating stuff. Lots of great things to look. And by the way, by all means, go ahead and watch, if you didn't have a chance to, my conversation, the live chat that we did last week with Billy Carson. It was extraordinary. I've heard from so many people. People have actually called me and said, Alexis, that was an awesome conversation. Billy is the man, I got to tell you. Always a fascinating conversation, never a dull moment with him. By the way, before I go any further, have you subscribed yet? Have you smashed the like button? We love those likes. YouTube loves likes. Look, I'm going to bring this up every single time. I know that's what everyone's doing now, but I'll tell you why this is important for me, and you probably heard this before. Because we have such a sophisticated system in YouTube with its algorithms et al., by liking this video, only if you do, it helps to reach more people. And if you feel that the conversations that we're having here are worthy of being proliferated out to more people, go ahead and hit the like button so more people, because more people will be alerted. It's as simple as that. And that I go for. So I will continue to kindly ask you to, of course, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and like the episode if you do. Okay, now on to other things. I think I have a couple of things here. Nope, one big one. Big announcement. Big announcement. I've had a few. Have you noticed in the last several months? It's been an exciting time, guys. In the midst of all the madness, there's been plenty of magic as well. Well, I've got a little bit of magic for you for next Wednesday's Higher Journeys. I am going to have, I guess you would call it a panel, guests that you know and love. Let me tell you who some of them are. Anthony Peake is coming back on. PMH Atwater, Cynthia Sue Larson, Mary Rodwell, and Penny Pierce, all at the same time. They will all be with me next Wednesday, because we together have something we want to share with you. So I'm just going to dangle a little carrot. I'm just teasing it, but I want to let you know you do not want to miss next Wednesday's show. As a matter of fact, I think we're going to premiere it so we can give everyone a heads up. Big announcement. I am so excited. This is why my schedule's been a little wonky lately, if you've noticed, because I've been burning the candle at both ends. But we'll be doing the big reveal on why they're joining me all at the same time. We're going to have a great conversation. Let me say again, Anthony Peake has written, I think, 11 books. He's like freaking phenomenal. I love Anthony to pieces. Anthony Peake, let's see if I can memorize, Mary Rodwell, PMH Atwater, Penny Pierce, and Cynthia Sue Larson, along with yours truly. We'll be having a fantastic conversation, discussion, and you'll find out why they're going to be working a lot closer with Higher Journeys in the future. So excited. So don't miss that. Okay? Okay. Let's see how we're doing. Close to a half hour. Not too bad. Journeyers, have a magnificent day. As always, keep the mind open, the heart and the soul and the spirit. And whether we take on whatever we take on as sustenance or not, let's have love and compassion for that which is around us, as I do in this beautiful garden. And I love you. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.